The morning sun cast long shadows across Jeremiah Washington's 200-acre farm in rural Georgia. At 52, Jeremiah was a large man, 6 feet tall and weighing nearly 300 pounds, with calloused hands that spoke of decades working the soil. His neighbors saw him as nothing more than a quiet farmer who kept to himself, tending his crops of corn, soybeans, and vegetables with methodical precision. What they didn't know was that 20 years ago, Chief Petty Officer Jeremiah Washington had been one of the Navy's most decorated SEALs. Jeremiah had purchased the farm 15 years earlier with his military pension and savings. After 2 decades of overseas deployments, classified missions, and the constant edge of combat, he craved nothing more than peace. The weight he'd gained since leaving the service was intentional, a buffer between his old life and new one. He let his hair grow out, wore overalls instead of fatigues, and spoke in the slow, measured drawl of a man who had all the time in the world. His days followed a predictable rhythm. Up at dawn to tend the animals, a handful of cattle, some chickens, and 2 old horses. Check the crops, mend fences, maintain equipment. In the evenings, he'd sit on his porch with sweet tea, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and purple. The local community gradually accepted him. He sold his produce at the farmers' market, helped neighbors during harvest time, and donated vegetables to the local food bank. To everyone in Millbrook County, he was just Jerry, a soft-spoken farmer who minded his own business. But some people couldn't leave well enough alone. The Iron Wolves had been operating in the area for 3 years, a motorcycle gang that dealt drugs and extorted local businesses. Their leader, Travis "Snake" Morrison, was a violent man with prison tattoos covering his arms and a reputation for brutality. The gang had about 20 members, mostly white men with criminal records and chips on their shoulders. They'd been eyeing Jeremiah's property for months. His farm sat on valuable land, close enough to the interstate for drug trafficking but isolated enough to avoid law enforcement attention. Snake figured the fat black farmer would be an easy mark. The harassment started small. Motorcycles roaring past his driveway at all hours. Trash dumped on his property. Threatening notes left on his mailbox. When Jeremiah took the notes to Sheriff Coleman, the man barely glanced at them. "Probably just kids playing pranks," Coleman said with a shrug. "You know how it is out there. Maybe consider selling that land, Jerry. Move somewhere safer." Jeremiah said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He recognized the sheriff's tone, the casual dismissal, the subtle suggestion that he didn't belong. It was the same attitude he'd faced growing up in Detroit, the same prejudice that had driven him to excel in the military where performance mattered more than skin color, at least, most of the time. The real trouble started on a humid Tuesday evening in August. Jeremiah was feeding his cattle when he heard the rumble of motorcycle engines. 5 bikes roared up his driveway, kicking up clouds of red dust. Snake Morrison climbed off his Harley, flanked by 4 of his lieutenants. "Evening, farmer," Snake said, his voice carrying the lazy menace of a predator toying with prey. "Nice place you got here." "Real nice." Jeremiah straightened slowly, his hand resting on the fence post. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Snake laughed, showing yellowed teeth. "Gentlemen. I like that. Yeah, you can help us. See, we've been thinking this land would be perfect for business ventures. Storage facilities, you might say. We're prepared to make you a generous offer." "Not interested." "Now, don't be hasty." Snake stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "This is a dangerous area. Lots of accidents happen to folks who don't have proper protection. For a reasonable monthly fee, we could make sure nothing bad happens to you or your property." Jeremiah's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a coldness that hadn't been there moments before. "I said I'm not interested." One of Snake's men, a thin biker with needle tracks on his arms, laughed. "Look at this fat boy trying to act tough. What you gonna do, farmer? Sit on us?" The others chuckled, but Snake held up a hand. "Easy, boys. We're being civilized here. He turned back to Jeremiah. You got 24 hours to think about our offer. After that. He shrugged. Well, accidents happen. They roared away, leaving Jeremiah standing in the settling dust. He watched until their taillights disappeared, then walked back to his house. In the bedroom closet, behind boxes of winter clothes, he pulled out a metal case he hadn't opened in 5 years. Inside, carefully maintained and wrapped in oilcloth, was his Sig Sauer P226, the same pistol that had saved his life in Fallujah, Kandahar, and a dozen other places he wasn't allowed to talk about. That night, Jeremiah sat on his porch, the weight of the pistol familiar in his lap. Muscle memory was a strange thing. His body remembered the stance, the grip, the smooth trigger pull, even after years of forcing himself to forget. 23 years ago, 18-year-old Jerome Washington had enlisted in the Navy to escape the streets of Detroit. He'd been angry then, angry at a world that saw him as just another black kid from the projects, angry at the teachers who wrote him off, angry at the system that seemed designed to churn out either dead kids or prisoners. The Navy had given him purpose. Bud/S training had nearly killed him, 6 months of the most punishing physical and mental torture ever devised. Of his class of 180 hopefuls, only 23 graduated. Jeremiah had been one of them, earning his trident and the right to call himself a Navy SEAL. For the next 15 years, he'd served with distinction. 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, countless classified operations in places that didn't officially exist on maps. He'd been a sniper, a demolitions expert, a close-quarters combat specialist. His teammates had called him the Ghost for his ability to move silently through enemy territory. He'd saved lives, taken lives, and done things that would haunt him until the day he died. The Navy had made him into a weapon, a precise, efficient, deadly weapon. When he'd finally mustered out, he'd sworn to put that life behind him, but some things, once learned, could never be forgotten. The Iron Wolves returned the next evening with their entire crew, 20 bikers, armed and confident. They expected to find a terrified farmer ready to sign over his property. Instead, they found an empty farmhouse with all the lights on. "Where is he?" Snake demanded, kicking open the front door. "Probably hiding in the barn," one of his men suggested. "Want me to smoke him out?" "We do this clean," Snake ordered. "Burn the house, kill the livestock, trash everything. He'll get the message." They spread out across the property, confident in their numbers. That was their first mistake. Jeremiah had spent the afternoon preparing. Old habits died hard, and planning was in his blood. He'd studied the terrain, identified choke points, prepared fallback positions. His farm wasn't just his home, it was now his battlefield. The first biker went down silently, taken out by a sleeper hold as he wandered behind the chicken coop. The second fell to a throwing knife that appeared out of nowhere, dropping him without a sound. It took 10 minutes for the others to realize 2 of their number were missing. "Jimmy. Carlos." Snake called out. "Where the hell are you?" That's when the lights went out. In the darkness, Jeremiah was in his element. Years of night operations had taught him to move like a shadow, to kill silently, to use darkness as both weapon and shield. The bikers, accustomed to intimidating civilians, found themselves hunting a predator. Snake's flashlight beam swept across the barn, illuminating nothing but hay bales and farm equipment. Behind him, one of his men screamed, a sound that cut off abruptly. "It's just one fat farmer." Snake shouted, but his voice carried a tremor. "Spread out. Find him." Another scream echoed from the direction of the cornfield, followed by silence. The Iron Wolves were down to 15 men, then 12, then 8. Jeremiah moved through them like death itself, using every skill the Navy had taught him. He took their weapons, their radios, their night vision goggles. He turned their own equipment against them, their numbers into a liability. By midnight, only Snake and 2 of his lieutenants remained, huddled back to back in the farmhouse kitchen, jumping at every shadow. "This is impossible," one of them whispered. "It's just one guy." That's when Jeremiah stepped out of the darkness. It appeared so suddenly that Snake's lieutenant actually screamed. In the moonlight streaming through the kitchen window, Jeremiah looked like something from a nightmare. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with mud and blood, none of it his own. In his hands, he carried a tactical knife that gleamed silver in the pale light, but it was his eyes that terrified them most. Gone was the gentle farmer they'd confronted the day before. These were the eyes of a killer, cold and measuring, calculating the most efficient way to end their lives. Jesus Christ, Snake breathed, raising his shotgun with shaking hands. What are you? I'm a man who wants to be left alone, Jeremiah said quietly. His voice was different now, not the rural drawl of Jerry the farmer, but the clipped, precise speech of Chief Petty Officer Washington. Your friends are alive. Unconscious, zip-tied, and probably concussed, but alive. You have a choice to make. You're bluffing, Snake said, but his voice cracked. You can't take all of us. Jeremiah tilted his head slightly. Snake Morrison, age 37, 3 convictions for assault, 2 for drug trafficking. Your real name is Travis Morrison, and you've got a daughter in Jacksonville named Kelly who doesn't know her father is a criminal. He shifted his gaze to the man on Snake's left. Danny Rourke, armed robbery, served 6 years at Reedsville. Your mother still lights candles for you at St. Mary's Catholic Church every Sunday, praying you'll turn your life around. The men stared at him in shock. How could he possibly know these things? I spent 3 hours making phone calls after you left yesterday, Jeremiah continued. Amazing what you can learn about people when you know the right databases to access. I know where you live, where your families live, where you bank, what you drive, and how much money you owe your suppliers. He took a step closer, and both men flinched. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to collect your unconscious friends and leave my property. You're going to find new territory, somewhere far from here. And if I ever see you again, if you ever so much as drive through this county again, I will hunt you down and eliminate you with extreme prejudice. Do we understand each other? Snake's bravado finally cracked. Who the hell are you? Jeremiah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I'm a farmer who used to be very good at killing people. Don't make me remember how good. By dawn, the iron wolves were gone. They loaded their unconscious members into pickup trucks and disappeared, leaving behind only tire tracks and the bitter smell of fear. Snake Morrison's motorcycle gang relocated to Alabama within the week, telling anyone who asked that Georgia was too hot for their operation. Sheriff Coleman arrived at Jeremiah's farm the next afternoon, expecting to find a crime scene. Instead, he found Jerry calmly repairing a fence post. Heard there was some trouble out here last night, Coleman said carefully. Neighbors reported gunshots. Just me, shooting at some coyotes that were after my chickens, Jeremiah replied without looking up. You know how it is, predators always looking for easy prey. Coleman studied him for a long moment. Something was different about the farmer, though he couldn't put his finger on what. There was a stillness to him now, an alertness that hadn't been there before. Well, the sheriff said finally, if you have any more trouble with coyotes, you be sure to call. I will, Jeremiah said. But I don't expect they'll be back. Word gets around pretty fast among predators when hunting grounds aren't as safe as they look. People began treating him differently. Not with fear, but with a new kind of respect. Neighboring farmers started asking his advice on security measures. Local businesses invited him to join their merchant association. The bank president personally approved his loan for new equipment. The changes weren't all external. Jeremiah found himself walking taller, speaking with more authority. He'd spent 15 years trying to bury Chief Petty Officer Washington, but the confrontation had reminded him that some things were worth fighting for. He didn't need to be ashamed of what he'd been, he just needed to choose carefully when and how to use those skills. 3 months later, Maria Santos knocked on his door. She was a young Latina woman who ran a small grocery store in town with her husband. The tears in her eyes told Jeremiah everything he needed to know. "They want protection money," she said quietly. "Los Diablos, they say if we don't pay, they'll burn down our store. The sheriff says his hands are tied because they haven't actually done anything yet." Jeremiah poured her a glass of sweet tea and listened to her story. Los Diablos was a different kind of gang, more organized than the Iron Wolves, with connections to larger criminal organizations. They were careful, smart, and dangerous. "How much do they want?" he asked. $2,000 a month. "We don't have that kind of money. The store barely makes enough to feed our family." Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then he smiled, the same cold smile he'd shown Snake Morrison. "Mrs. Santos," he said gently, "I think it's time Los Diablos learned the same lesson as the Iron Wolves. Some communities are under better protection than they realize." Chapter 11. The network. Over the following year, Jeremiah quietly built something unprecedented in rural Georgia, a network of trained civilians capable of defending their community. He identified other veterans living in the area, former Marines, Army Rangers, even a retired Air Force pararescue jumper. Most were like him, men who'd served with distinction but wanted nothing more than to live in peace. Didn't recruit them with speeches about duty or patriotism. Instead, he simply explained the situation. Their community was under threat from organized criminals who preyed on hardworking families. Law enforcement was either unable or unwilling to provide adequate protection. Good people needed help. The response was overwhelming. Jake Morrison, no relation to Snake, had been a Marine sniper in Iraq. He now ran a small auto repair shop and was tired of watching gangs intimidate his customers. Sarah Chen, a former Army intelligence officer, worked as the local librarian but still maintained contacts throughout law enforcement. Carlos Mendez had been a Navy corpsman and now served as the town's EMT. He'd treated too many victims of gang violence to stand by and do nothing. They met monthly at Jeremiah's farm, ostensibly for barbecues and social gatherings. In reality, they shared intelligence, coordinated responses to threats, and maintained their skills through discreet training exercises. To outside observers, it looked like a veterans' social club. In reality, it was a highly effective civilian defense network. The network's effectiveness was tested when the Valdez cartel decided to expand their operations into Georgia. Unlike the local gangs, the Valdez organization was sophisticated, well-funded, and utterly ruthless. They moved into Millbrook County with military precision, establishing distribution networks and eliminating competition with systematic violence. When they approached local businesses for tax payments, most complied out of fear. Those who didn't faced escalating consequences, broken windows, vandalized property, and eventually direct violence against family members. The cartel made a critical error when they targeted the Santos family. Maria's husband, Eduardo, refused to pay their demands. The next night, their grocery store was firebombed. Eduardo suffered second-degree burns trying to save their inventory, and their 7-year-old daughter was traumatized by the attack as Sheriff Coleman arrested 2 low-level cartel members, but they were released on bail within hours. The message was clear. The Valdez cartel owned the criminal justice system in Millbrook County. When Jeremiah decided it was time to remind the world why Navy SEALs had such a fearsome reputation. The Valdez cartel's local operations were run by Antonio Valdez himself, nephew of the organization's leader. Antonio was smart, ruthless, and careful. He'd never been successfully prosecuted despite a career spanning 2 decades. He operated from a fortified compound outside town, protected by armed guards and sophisticated security systems. Antonio considered himself untouchable. He was wrong. The operation began at 0300 on a moonless Tuesday night. Jeremiah and his team moved with the precision of a military unit, because that's exactly what they were, just older, heavier, and more motivated than they'd been in their prime. Sarah Chen had used her intelligence contacts to map the compound's security systems. Jake Morrison positioned himself 800 meters away with his hunting rifle, providing overwatch. Carlos Mendez waited with a medical kit and getaway vehicle. Other team members created diversions throughout the county, ensuring law enforcement would be busy elsewhere. Jeremiah went in alone. The compound's perimeter sensors detected nothing as he slipped through shadows, a middle-aged farmer moving like the ghost he'd once been. 2 guards fell unconscious without ever knowing he'd been there. Security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned. Motion detectors registered nothing but wind. Antonio Valdez woke to find a large black man sitting in his bedroom's leather chair, calmly field-stripping a pistol. "Good morning, Mr. Valdez," Jeremiah said politely. "We need to have a conversation." Antonio reached for the gun in his nightstand drawer and found it empty. He lunged for the panic button that would summon his guards and discovered the wires had been cut. He grabbed his cell phone and realized there was no signal. Someone was jamming communications. "What do you want?" he demanded, trying to maintain his composure. "I want you to leave," Jeremiah said simply, reassembling his weapon with practiced efficiency. "I want you to take your organization and find somewhere else to operate. Somewhere that isn't my community." Antonio laughed, but it came out strained. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. Do you know what happens to people who threaten the Valdez family?" "I know exactly what happens," Jeremiah replied. "I've read the files. 347 documented murders over the past decade, plus an estimated 200 disappearances. Very impressive." He finished with his pistol and looked up, his eyes reflecting the bedside lamp's light like a predator's. "I also know what happened to Miguel Santos in Tucson, tortured for 3 days before you killed him. Rosa Martinez in El Paso, murdered in front of her children. The Gutierrez family in Houston, all 5 of them, including the baby." Antonio's face went pale. How could this farmer possibly know about operations that had been kept absolutely secret? "You're afraid," Jeremiah observed. "Good. That means you're not stupid. Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Valdez. You're going to pack up your operation and leave Georgia. You're going to compensate the Santos family for their losses, let's say $50,000. And you're going to spread the word that Millbrook County is off limits to your organization. And if I refuse?" Jeremiah smiled, and Antonio felt ice water flow through his veins. "Then I'm going to hunt down every member of your organization, starting with your Uncle Ramon in Mexico City and working my way down through your entire family tree. I'm going to use methods I learned from some very unpleasant people in some very dark places, and when I'm finished, the Valdez cartel will be nothing but a cautionary tale told in whispers." He stood up slowly, his bulk seeming to fill the room. "You have 48 hours. Don't make me come looking for you." Antonio Valdez evacuated Georgia within 36 hours, taking his entire organization with him. The $50,000 appeared in the Santos family's bank account the following day, along with a note apologizing for the misunderstanding. Within a week, cartel operations in Millbrook County had completely ceased. Sheriff Coleman launched an investigation into the Valdez withdrawal, but found nothing concrete. There were reports of a break-in at the compound, but no evidence of violence or theft. Security footage showed nothing but technical malfunctions. The cartel members he questioned claimed they were simply restructuring their operations. The sheriff suspected Jerry the farmer was involved somehow, but couldn't prove anything. More importantly, he wasn't sure he wanted to prove anything. Crime in his county had dropped to historic lows, and prominent citizens were praising his department's effectiveness. Sometimes, Coleman reflected, it was better not to ask too many questions. 2 years later, Jeremiah was surprised to receive a visitor from his past. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell had been his commanding officer during his final tour in Afghanistan. She was now working for a joint task force on domestic terrorism and had been investigating the unusual pattern of gang withdrawals from rural Georgia. "Hello, Chief," she said with a smile, using his old rank. "Permission to come aboard?" They sat on his porch, drinking sweet tea and watching the sunset. Mitchell was direct, as she'd always been. "I know it's you," she said simply. The tactical precision, the intelligence gathering, the psychological warfare, it has your fingerprints all over it. The question is, what do I do about it? Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment. I'm just a farmer now, ma'am. Retired, disabled veteran trying to make an honest living. Disabled? Mitchell raised an eyebrow. Your medical records indicate a bad knee and some hearing loss. PTSD, Jeremiah said quietly. I can't stand seeing innocent people terrorized by predators. Sometimes I have episodes where I revert to old training. Mitchell studied his face, seeing the truth behind his words. The man sitting across from her was indeed different from the warrior she'd once commanded. He was older, softer, carrying the weight of choices that had never gotten easier. But underneath, the steel was still there, tempered now by wisdom and compassion. The FBI would love to prosecute a few cartel leaders, she said finally. But they seem to have developed a sudden aversion to operating in this area. Strangest thing. Predators avoid hunting grounds where the prey fights back, Jeremiah observed. Natural selection. Mitchell smiled and stood to leave. Take care of yourself, Chief. And keep up the good work. 5 years later, Millbrook County had become something unique in rural America, a community where crime simply didn't pay. Gang activity was non-existent. Drug trafficking had moved to other areas. Property values had risen as families moved in from Atlanta, seeking a safe place to raise their children. Jeremiah's farm had become the unofficial headquarters for what locals called the Veterans Alliance, a loose network of retired military personnel who served as community advocates, emergency responders, and informal peacekeepers. They organized disaster relief, mentored at-risk youth, and maintained the area's reputation as a place where good people could live in peace. The fat black farmer was now a respected elder in the community, sought out for advice on everything from crop rotation to conflict resolution. Children who'd once been afraid of the big, quiet man now competed for his attention at the farmer's market, knowing he always had fresh apples and interesting stories. But sometimes, late at night, when reports filtered in about gang activity in neighboring counties, Jeremiah would take his old pistol from its case and clean it with the same methodical care he'd learned 25 years earlier, because some skills, once learned, were never really forgotten. And some communities were under better protection than anyone realized. The ghost hadn't retired, he'd just found a better mission.